resume our discussions now. In this session, we will discuss issues relating to Indo-Pacific. And for this, I'll first request Dr. Hu Shishang, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies at TK. You are starting first. to make his remarks, and after that we'll request Dr. Malad Joshi to speak. Dr. Hu is an old friend of India, and good to welcome him back to New Delhi after 3 weeks.
Glad to be back again. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador. Very considerable arrangement for our this time academic trip to India. According to the agenda, my topic will be related to Indo-Pacific. I just give a Chinese scholar's perspective on Indo-Pacific. Although we know that there are so many Indo-Pacific concepts or strategy or vision, not only the United States but also Japan's, India's, Indonesia's, later on maybe ASEAN's will also have ASEAN vision of Indo-Pacific. Anyway, it became a very popular concept or strategy in the vast region called Indo-Pacific, but still Chinese government is still reluctant in taking this the Indo-Pacific concept into confidence. Still, they are suspicious. So, as a Chinese scholar, I just want to focus mainly on the United States Indo-Pacific strategy. I think in the past 1 year, Indo-Pacific United States has developed really from a concept into a strategy. When you visit the Pentagon City or the State Department of U.S. last year, they were the officers usually when they mention Indo-Pacific, they will naturally combine it with strategy. So in this regard, we tend to believe, although officially they are not this kind of minted, but out of their practice, I can say that they already regarded this is not only a concept, it is a kind of strategy. So as for our strategy, what is the purpose? I just want to elaborate into 4 aspects. The first one is one target. The second is 2 approaches. The third is 3 guiding principles. The fourth is the 4 major actors or players. So I just following this in order to remember it in a more simple way. So one target, what the one target of the U.S. Indo-Pacific mean? I think the one target is China. Of course, this is becoming the trans-party consensus in the United States that regarding China as a strategic rivalry. There is no question about it. So as for the Indo-Pacific strategy for U.S., the targeting China and specifically targeting China's Belt and Road Initiative. That is quite sure. According to the advisor, the former advisor to President Trump, Bannon, mentioned once that the U.S. has only 5 years to take some measures to check China. That is to say, 5 years is that's according to his argument. The coming 5 years is a final strategic opportunity for U.S. to check China, to contain China. So one of the significant platforms to contain China is this one, Indo-Pacific. According to my personal understanding, Indo-Pacific strategy just is a enlarged vision of rebalance of Asia rebalance strategy of Obama. One of the biggest difference, of course, that include India in a more logical way. Indian Ocean, India in a more logical way. But the targeting, of course, China and China's Belt and Road Initiative. What is the two approaches to practice it or to make it happen? One, of course, is military means. That is the initial purpose of this strategy of the United States. So we can see that what the United States has done that in the Trump first year, second year, third year, the enhancing the military fees, the defense expenditures in a huge margin. Now that it is nearly the highest, according to the latest defense budget in 2020, I think that is already the highest in history of United States in the defense budget. If according to 2016's budget, the Americans itself has more expenditures on defense than the following 9 countries put it together. So, secondly, is that the free navigation in South China Sea more frequently. In the past, maybe very irregular. In 2018, maybe 2 months once. But starting from 2019, maybe each month once. And you are also encouraging more partners, allies to follow the suit, like French, British, Australia, Japan, even ASEAN countries, even encouraging India to follow suit. So make it like an internationalized operation, not U.S. U.S. individual or operation. And also enhancing the military cooperation or relations with its allies and also with its strategic partners, including India, like the bilateral, trilateral security dialogues, like the military exercises, like asking Japan or even South Asia to enhancing the defense budget, and so on, and also enhancing U.S. relations with Taiwan, and also that had established a more rigid auditing or review on the Chinese investment in the U.S. Especially the security has been included in their auditing towards China investment in the U.S. And of course encouraging the Quad, the 4 countries Quad, to put more investment on military. This is military means. The second 2 approaches, another approach is economic means. Because of India and Japan encouraging the USA to put more on economic aspect in Indo-Pacific strategy. So the US last year really has taken some very specific measures, like that reviving their foreign assistance law systems and even mechanisms, had passed in the Parliament the Build Act, for example, enhancing their foreign assistance, mobilizing their more foreign assistance resources, and also putting forward the Indo-Pacific infrastructure construction plans, and also initiate like the Bay of Bengal initiative, and also change the name of Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Dialogue into Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Dialogue, and also changing the PANCOM into Indo-Pacific Command. That is the military means, okay. But for the economic means, like the Quad. We know the Quad is a security. It should be a security platform. But last year, when we saw the second or the third dialogue of Quad, they're focusing much more on physical connectivities. Even they had discussed the democratic development in Maldives, in Sri Lanka. So it seems that they have some changes of their focus. I think maybe because of Indian and Japan's efforts in this regard. And also, I think one of the approaches in this regard is that the launching the the trading war against China, that reducing China's capacity and resources in the Belt and Road Initiative, and also, of course, in this regard, encouraging Japan to play a bigger role in economic means. And Japan would like to take the lead, like that make CPTPP, the comprehensive and progressive TPP, to enter into effect by the end of last year. And also the Japan raised the big B, right? Big B means Belt of Industrial Growth in the Belt of Bengal, Big B plan, and also, of course, with India pushing forward the AAGC, the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. I think these all belong to the economic approaches. As for the three guiding principles, we all know there are two guiding principles. One is rule-based order. The second is free and open. The third I would like to add here is that American first. American first should be regarded as one of the guiding principles for Indo-Pacific, because we know that the Vice President Pence in the APEC summit in PNG, right? Papua New Guinea. He mentioned this American piracy. No, not piracy. American first. Okay. It is all from my heart. American first. He said, why I practice this government practice American first? Because only when America become much stronger, we can protect you from aggression from some country. Some country here, of course, indicating to China. But as to two other principles, I can say that China is also would like to take it. For example, that in the SCO Qingdao summit, in the statement, we already mentioned that we'll follow the rule-based order. That is the last June, the Qingdao summit of SO, and also in last year's APEC summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping also mentioned in his speech that China will also follow the rule-based order. That is quite sure. As for the free and open, of course, China is for it. Well, of course, we advocate the free and open, although we haven't encountered any kind of obstacles along the slopes along the Indian Ocean, but still, we have some concern, especially in the Western Pacific region. Our concern is not the Indian Ocean, the Western Pacific region, because of U.S. Building up so many military allies. So we concern not, just like the U.S. concern are not about South China Seas, free navigation or free aviation. China is also for it. So it is not exclusively the U.S. demanding. It is also China's requirement. But firstly, just like what U.S. has done, that if you want the free and open, you first should have that kind of capacity to guarantee the free and open. That is the three guiding principles. The final aspect of my presentation is the four major actors, of course, or players. Of course, I believe that all of us know that. That is the U.S., Japan, India, Australia. Maybe in the future, ASEAN could play some role. But these four countries are the major players, of course, for a long time. Especially when we considering that in the future of coming years, the competition between China's BRI and Americans' Indo-Pacific strategy will be there for many years. For many years. It is a kind of competition for rules of laws, rule of order, rule of everything. So in this regard, China also pay much attention to building up good relations, or first stabilizing our relation with U.S. The second, we will try to maintain or building up more constructive cooperation with Japan, India, Australia. We see during the Chinese government's efforts last year, we see that Sino-Japan relations has really have a positive change direction changing. And both sides agree that they will cooperate in a third market. This is very, very constructive. It shows how clever Shinzo Abe government becomes. And also, last year, especially through the Wuhan informal dialogue meeting, we see that there is a big change for betterment, for good between China and Indian relations. We value our relations with India a lot, especially under the background of Indo-Pacific strategy, because that all the other two are American allies. There's no change. They will follow the Americans' order. But India is the most significant variable in this strategy. If the U.S. wants the Indo-Pacific strategy to be really useful in containing China, the U.S. had to build up more consolidate relations with India or win India's support in this regard. If India not supported, I'm wondering whether this strategy can succeed in the future. So in this regard, China also values the relations with India. I can say frankly that India now located in the most favorable international environment. I think that is also a great golden opportunity for India to realize, to rising into a major power. This is a strategic asset opportunities. I just want to stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Hu, for that very cogent and clear presentation on how you look at U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, how it has evolved from concept to strategy in recent months, and what are the implications? What's the Chinese response? I'll now request Dr. Manoj Joshi to make his presentation on this subject.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try and give a bigger overview where I would look at U.S. Chinese point of view as well as the Indian reaction. I think geography originally was meant to be static, and we have grown up speaking of this region as Asia Pacific. And suddenly the concept has given way to the concept of Indo-Pacific. So what we are seeing is how geopolitics is playing out. By renaming the region, countries like Japan and the US, they are shifting gears, the mental gears, their own as well as that of the region. And when it was just Asia Pacific, China was looking very big. Now it is Indo-Pacific because India is also quite big. China is looking a little smaller. So there is a geopolitical angle there. There are of course two rival visions. We have the Chinese vision, which is China in the middle, China dream, sometimes community of common destiny, which some people say is derived from the Zhao dynasty concept of Tianjia, all under the heaven. But of course, those are kind of philosophical points. As far as the American and Japanese vision is concerned, it was first looked at as the pivot, and now the idea has been expressed as free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think it's very clear when you use words like free and open, what you're doing is that into geography you are adding some politics into it. But by itself, changing the name doesn't make much of a difference. What really matters is how is it going to play out economically. The Chinese mechanics are working through the Belt and Road initiative, where they are investing a huge amount of money. Now, all this is important for India because Chinese geo-economic activity is now taking the form through geopolitical assertion. It is doing so in our neighborhood in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region. Many target countries see BRI as very useful. They can get into the economic growth bandwagon. They are heartened by the prospect of getting investment to enhance their infrastructure and industry. But the way it is structured, it also means growing interdependence with China. This has become an issue with regard to BRI. The US notion has come in of the Indo-Pacific has come in. More recently, I think President Trump was speaking in 2017, in November 2017. He laid out the vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which had been articulated by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe earlier. Then in November, we saw US Vice President Mike Pence. He wrote an op-ed in Washington Post. He spoke of Indo-Pacific where commerce flows unhindered and where independent nations are masters of their own destiny. So this is what the Americans have now. First, the important point was how much money would they be put forward. So first they came up with $130 million. And I think Hu Xijin said that it would not be enough to build toilets also in Mumbai or something. But then the US has now come up with a new Build Act and they have put up $60 billion to start with. They have also sought collaboration with Japan. Now in August, Japan, US, Australia last year signed an agreement to promote quality infrastructure. The process has gotten underway again last year. The US is also restructuring its economic bodies like OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, to promote investment. And I think that's an important signal to the countries in the region that the US is serious about development cooperation. They're also changing their rules and laws with regard to that. Then, of course, there is the associated Japanese vision, which is close to that of India, which sees the field of action from Japan all the way to the east to Africa. Japan is a major player in infrastructure construction directly as well as through ADB. They're very active in Southeast Asia and India. At the same time, on the occasion of the first visit by a Japanese Prime Minister to China in 11 years, the two countries agreed to cooperate in 50 infrastructural projects. So this is quite a notable development last year, where Japan kind of indirectly has committed itself to the Belt and Road initiative, as it were. Now, of course, there are upon all this are the security visions of the different parties. So once you have the US spoke and hub system, the United States relationship with the Republic of Korea, with Republic of China, US and Australia, US and Japan, and the effort has been to link the spokes, as it were, not as alliances, but as what strategic groupings, as Ashton Carter used to say, principal security networks. The Chinese strategists often say that they dismiss this call for Indo-Pacific security architecture as a means to contain China. But then, simultaneously, China itself, Chinese military activity, has led to the consolidation of China in the South China Sea. And of course, the Chinese focus is also looking at building security structures in all of Eurasia. The SCO and CICIR are two versions of this. As for the Indian Ocean, the Chinese see it as an adjunct to the South China Sea. In the sense, the consolidation of Chinese authority in South China Sea invariably will lead to an opening into the Malacca Straits and into the Indian Ocean, where the Chinese Navy has been active for the last almost since 2014, a great amount of activity, and where China is building what could be dual-use port facilities. And then, of course, these are trilaterals: India, Japan, Australia, India, US, Japan, Malabar exercises, quad groupings, which I'll speak about a little later. The fourth vision, which emphasizes, is the centrality of the ASEAN. This is a very important thing because almost all parties agree that ASEAN centrality is very important for looking at Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific security order. So these are listed in East Asia, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM Plus format. Formally, at least all of us agree, even China agrees, the concept of centrality of ASEAN. They are all participants in ASEAN mechanisms. However, the body itself is quite divided. ASEAN hasn't given a very clear verdict on the Indo-Pacific concept. Last year there was a meeting in Indonesia, but again, nothing really substantial came out of that. As for India, speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, Prime Minister Modi spoke of a region from the shores of Africa to that of the Americas, and from the Indo-Pacific construct, he very clearly said it is a geographical definition. He insisted that India does not see Indo-Pacific region as a strategy or a club of limited members. So I think that is a very clear statement on the part of India. Indian policy follows that. And this, of course, came after the Wuhan summit in April. But in addition to defining this as a geographical region, Prime Minister Modi also talked about equal access to the region under international law, to use the common spaces on the sea, freedom of navigation, peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with the international law, which was necessary for a democratic and rules-based international order. And he made it very clear what his politics were. In any case, he emphasized we will work with others to keep our seas, space, airways free and open. Now, if you look at the Indian activity, we have been active in the Indian Ocean with other countries. We have exercised with the ASEAN since the 90s. We have had bilateral Malabar exercise, the US since 1992. We have exercises now with virtually all the countries of the region. India has coordinated patrols with Indonesia, Thailand, bilateral exercises with Singapore, Australia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam. There's a huge list of the Indian naval exercises. In addition to that, India has been active in promoting the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium as well. Now, briefly, I'll touch on this issue of Quad. 2017, this Quad came up at the sidelines of the East Asia Summit. Four-way dialogue, which had originally been kicked off in 2007. It had actually arisen out of the response to the Asian tsunami of 2004-2005. Re-establishing was an important way, kind of connecting it to the hub and spoke system of the United States. But the Quad is not a military alliance. In the 3 meetings it has had so far, all of the four sides have issued their respective press releases, largely similar, but they have spoken. They have not issued any kind of a joint statement. So they've been very clear about that. The Indian, for example, the last time the Indian one did not speak about sovereignty, international law, freedom of navigation, but it pointedly referred to Prime Minister Modi's Shangri-La statement, which had actually mentioned those issues. Recently, in March 2019, the commander of the US Indo-Pacific Command suggested that the Quad could maybe shelved for now. The United States apparently does not see, they think that India is not cooperating sufficiently. But the Indian perspective has been very different. We see largely as so far as a diplomatic grouping, and today the newspaper has just announced that India has appointed a senior officer in the Ministry of External Affairs to head a new office of the Indo-Pacific, Mr. Vikram Doraiswamy. The Quad actually is in a very nascent stage, and it is seeking to address the shifting balance of power in the region, basically through a mix of cooperation and competition. So it's not trying to be interesting. What it's trying to do, we have seen the rise of China, we have seen Chinese activity in the South China Sea, and I think basically what we are trying to do in collaboration with various countries is to convince China that working along with the international rules of the game is a better idea, is a better way of cooperation, is a better option than the kind of unilateral actions which sometimes creates problems. To sum up, I think it would be wrong to see all these developments which we have spoken of, the hub and spoke system or the Quad or the Indo-Pacific, in terms of binaries. China versus US, India versus China kind of an approach. As you can see, naval exercises which we have had, they even go beyond, they started in the 1990s. So they're not really any part of the Indo-Pacific concept. These are things which had predated all that. And then when you look at Indian diplomacy, you see India is a member of SCO, we are members of CICIR, we are members of the AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Likewise, China is a major partner of ASEAN. Singapore is a major investment in China. Likewise, China and the US are very big trade partners, and China is also a big trade partner of ours. Likewise, if you look at the other straws, you will see that Singapore, China has upgraded their FTA, and Japan's decision to participate in the FTI, in the BRI. So the point I'm trying to make is that Sometimes there is a tendency to look at this whole Indo-Pacific thing in binaries. I don't think that's a particularly good idea. The latest manifestation of this has been the East Asia Summit in November 2018, which has seen the countries of the region trying to get together to come up with a regional comprehensive economic partnership which will actually cover half the world's population. So, as I said, even when Japan and China enhance cooperation with each other, so are India and Japan trying to do the same. US and India also are trying to consolidate their partnership. Japan has played a significant role in enhancing connectivity in India. Japan is a major player and is now moving to third countries such as Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh and Africa. And as I said, the US and China are trying to work out their deal. What all the countries are seeking is to promote connectivity, enhance economic relations and trade with each other. Security issues have come up in the context of the South China Sea, but as of now, there is an attempt to work these out through dialogue. And as I said, that the effort, the diplomatic effort, or what you see, are basically efforts that to move in a positive direction to persuade the countries of the region to play by the international rules of the game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joshi, for that presentation. So we have just heard two excellent presentations on the construct of Indo-Pacific. Now the floor is open for discussion. Any comments from the Chinese side? Anyone would like to lead discussion?
Thank you, sir. Thanks for your friendly presentation about Indo-Pacific. Personally speaking, I have to say that I'm happy to hear that India take Indo-Pacific as more as a geographic concept rather than strategic concept. Because as we know, there's a lot of the scholars said that maybe Indo-Pacific is more about a strategic construct which integrates geography, free and open principles, and democratic values. I see that India is more inclusive about this concept. But as you also referred to the concept of a Quad, which includes the four members, the US, India, Australia, and Japan. So how do you view the prospect of Quad? Because I noticed that someone said maybe Quad, Indo-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific frame is something like Quad Plus. So how do you view this? Because also you said ASEAN centrality maybe is challenged by that concept. So how do you view the Quad Plus and the Indo-Pacific strategy? Thank you.
Okay. We'll take some more comments and then we'll request speakers to respond. Constantino, you wanted to stay along easier. Okay. We'll come back here.
Thank you, Ambassador Kanta, for having me here and giving me around 5 minutes, I think, to just quickly discuss the 5 main points. And it's wonderful to have, I think, a delegation from CICIR here in Delhi. I think more of your presence is needed here in Delhi to have these dialogues and these discussions in an open way. I think, unfortunately, the last few years saw a bit of a breakdown in that dialogue between India and China. I think it's a welcome development, and more of these platforms are now coming to existence. I just want to make 5 quick points. 5 points. I think first, and sort of 5 appeals, I think, to the Chinese side to sort of think about what the concerns and debates are here in Delhi these days about the rise of China, let's call it that. The first one is to recognize that these are fundamentally different developmental and political models, China and India. And that China's done a formidable job at taking out a record number of people out of absolute poverty with its own political developmental model. India has a very different one now. We see these days with 900 million people registered to vote. These are very different political systems. Their preferences, their moral approaches, their bets and predictions, but we don't know. The reality is the jury is out on how these two developmental models will work out over the last decades. I think there's questions within China, there are questions within India. But it'll be very interesting. It's important that we recognize those differences. There are different political cultures about the world, about domestic rule, about governance, etc. And that will facilitate the discussion if we recognize those differences instead of glossing over them and saying we are alike, we are same, we're both so different from the rest of the world. The second one is, I think, on this issue which came up in terms of hedging and the wedges, I think, in international structure. I'm not so sure that the U.S. is so bent on containing China under President Trump. I would not be surprised. I think there's several concerns here in Delhi that there may be some big bargain deal between China and the U.S. under President Trump, and that basically his trade war and all these big words and the big strategies you've been reading into and quoting on for today are a tactical approach to constrain China, certainly, but that there will be a big transactional arrangement between the US and China, which will create some type of condominium and a sort of bipolar structure within the system, which is of concern to India. So let's see. Again, we will see how that works out. But you see, just look at the US-Europe relation. Same thing President Trump did with the EU. He attacked NATO, he attacked the EU at its core, and within 8 months he made peace with the European Union and had a new bargain deal with the Europeans. So I think we shouldn't be so sure that everyone is containing. Actually, everyone's hedging their bets. India's keeping its doors open with China. We see it happening. The Japanese, as mentioned by Mr. Joshi, are doing the exact same thing. They're playing on the RCEP, on the TPP, on a possible free trade deal with China, on BRI. They're playing on all chessboards at the same time. So there's definitely a hedging policy. So any type of wedges China wants to introduce in terms of divide and rule, include some differences choose between us and the US, I think is going to be counterproductive. Third is, let me make a very provocative point here that I think China is already part of the Indo-Pacific. And what I mean by this is that, China's often said that the BRI is inclusive. Why is India so upset? Please join. The same argument can be made from the Indo-Pacific side. When Prime Minister Modi says that the Indo-Pacific strategy for India's perception is an inclusive model, it means that there's a seat at the table which China can take up at any point it wishes. I would even suggest, when I say that China is already part of the Indo-Pacific, I work a lot in the neighborhood in Nepal, for example, that China's behavior in the last 2 years has changed fundamentally in various sectors. That China's adapted its behavior to at least speak certain norms which the Indo-Pacific strategy is based on. If you see it, Chinese approach to negotiations in terms of investments in Nepal these days, it's changed over the last 2 years. It says, yes, we'll do our connectivity projects in a more sustainable way. Tell us what you wish in Nepal. We won't import labor. We'll create local conditions. We'll respect the environment. This is the language of the Indo-Pacific, which I, at least, assess China to have adopted in some ways, at least in rhetoric, and in some ways in practice and negotiation strategies. Fourth point is, there's a growing gap between India and China in terms of capabilities. Let's be frank about that. Economic capacity, defense capacity, etc. One thing that history teaches us, and India has done with its neighbors, sometimes well, sometimes not, is that as the predominant power, you have to give concessions to the powers that are weaker. You have to take the initiative, be generous, give first advantages, be the prime mover in a relationship. I don't see China having taken that approach towards India. But I think the more concessions you give on trade, the border issue, nuclear issues, terror issues in Pakistan, the more you'll get out of the relationship. So it's incumbent on China now, and I don't see that yet, that adjustment in terms of the behavior, to give in and be generous and deal with this new asymmetry, which is creating tremendous mistrust and concerns and a security threat perception, whether it's unfounded or not, but it's creating that perception here. Last, I think, there's something, I think, a requirement for what I would call Chinese self-regulation, particularly within South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. Self-regulation, is that understandable, China is doing tremendous work in Nepal these days, for example. It's your neighbor country. It's your imperative to have developed connectivity which didn't exist in the last few centuries with Nepal. It's your immediate neighbor, their security interests, their economic interests in Nepal. So that's a genuine agenda from China. But at the same time, it's changing completely the balance of power in South Asia. You are now a resident power in South Asia, and I would say even in the Indian Ocean region. You are a power of this. You are within this region. You have new leverage, which you created within 5 to 10 years, which is formidable in many of these neighboring countries: Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal in particular. So there's no need to push, I think, too much. And self-regulation, I mean, is that many of these countries are going to use and have been using the tactics of playing one off against the other, India and China. You see it in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, and it's led to many crises, which has not been the intent of India often. But many of these countries are trying to play off China against India. So it makes the point, I think that's makes the point, it's very important for China and India to keep an open channel of communication about these third countries. Because often I think the tensions which have arisen in Sri Lanka, for example, are because of a lack of communication, exchanges of assessments, etc. And sort of security dilemma playing out in these third countries. So it's very important to keep those communication channels going on third countries, on political issues, because, I mean, this idea that economics are win-win and not politics, I think is an illusion. The moment you put in 10 or 20 billion dollars into Bangladesh, you're going to have economic and also political and security interests in where that money goes in Bangladesh. Every country does it, and it's nothing particular about China. So you will be politically entangled in the domestic affairs of these countries. You will have securitization agendas driving your economic outreach to the Indian Ocean region. But let's be under no illusion. I think the Chinese government has realized that, but needs that open communication channel in India to deal and not allow these crises to escalate, not allow these countries to play off one against the other. Let me finish on this account, reading out from a very interesting, 1960 statement when the Prime Minister of Nepal, B.P. Koirala, went to Beijing. This is 1960, very difficult times, as you know, in the relation between India and China, about to happen. But Prime Minister of Nepal went to Beijing, B.P. Koirala, and he was asking for Zhou Enlai, he was acting to Zhou Enlai, asking him to match economic aid which India was giving to Nepal. And he was saying, please give us as much as the Indians are giving. We want China to come into Nepal. And I'll just quote from the answer which Zhou Enlai gave at that point. He says, I want to say this may not be good for you, Nepal, or for us, China, to give you as much 18 crores of rupees the Indians were giving to Nepal. For you, because India may become wary if we give you too much assistance and get too much entangled in Nepal. It would be appropriate for us, it would be inappropriate for us because the international community would take it that we are trying to compete with India and Nepal. So therefore you are better off placed to get significant aid from India. So I think that's a very important lesson of how China has traditionally looked at these countries and understood that these are countries that have very strong ties with India, and nothing will change and cut those ties with India in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Javier, for those comments. I'll now invite Master Krishna Prakash.
Thank you, Chair. I have a simple question for Mr. Hu Shishang. Mr. Hu, you had mentioned while talking about South China Sea that in the last few months, the US patrolling has increased, that the US has been asking or encouraging other countries also to send their vessels, etc., etc. And you spoke about China wanting to follow the rule of law. Now my question is, whose law is China talking about when the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 gave an award in favor of Philippines? China ignored it. China has spoke about not militarizing the South China Sea, but in Spratlys you have established long-range missile batteries. Now you would appreciate that not just China, other countries also have an interest in South China Sea. So given what China says and what China does, are you surprised that the other countries have also are looking at things differently? And are you surprised at the reaction of the other countries? Thank you.
Master
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I really want to address my comments to Dr. Hu, with whom I struck a good friendship during the tea break. Now, what's interesting actually in your presentation, Dr. Hu, is that you're talking about the Indo-Pacific vision as a kind of a strategy to counter China. I'm just wondering as to why is this being seen as a strategy which seems to threaten China? It could be that it's suggesting a different approach as to how the Indo-Pacific should develop. And that approach is a question where the countries which are actually sort of either going to benefit from it or who are observing it, it's for them to actually make up as to how it's going to be helpful or not helpful. That's the first point. The second thing, of course, is the freedom of navigation issue. Now, perhaps I've tried with some other friends of mine, Chinese friends. If there is an official statement of the Chinese government as to what exactly do the 9 dashed lines in South China Sea represent, from every point of view, because I agonized over that Chinese government's note to the UN Committee for Continental Shelf, I think it's 2011. Just can't understand what exactly is it. Is it a claim to take the entire waters enclosed by the 9 dashed lines, or it is to make some claims based on these dashes, some maritime zones, or if maritime zones, on what basis? It's not clear. So I'm just wondering if somebody can even give an official position as to what exactly are these 9 dashed lines in terms of international law. Let's put it like that. The third issue is that you talk about the BRI, which is important. But I find now in all interaction with our Chinese colleagues, there is no mention of the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, for example. Why is the BRI not, why the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank not the platform for launching of all of these BRI projects? What is the reason for that? Why it's not being talked about? The BRICS also have development bank. They also talk about infrastructure and all these kind of, all these projects. Why is it that it is being taken outside of that? And that is why the question arises. And here I come to as to how these things actually affect. So if, for example, the BRI or Maritime Silk Route projects, road projects, tend to destabilize or make countries fragile, and we can talk about specific countries. Maldives is one example. If these countries become fragile, how is China, it's not that powerful in Indian Ocean, how is China going to create an infrastructure or an institutional infrastructure or a governance infrastructure in the Indian Ocean region, which actually will be of benefit to all in terms of providing good order at sea, for example. Because if these countries are becoming fragile, you cannot enforce any law, any rules. And here I just want to bring last point, just to finish. The Chinese government has entered into an agreement with Pakistan to give 8 submarines. Now, the impact of 8 submarines in the regional balance of power, I think you have to look into that issue as to how an alteration of balance of power because of the 8 submarines being given to Pakistan, how destabilizing is that going to be? Is it in Chinese interest? Is it in Pakistan's interest? Whose interest is it? And there's added issue here. The issue actually is that if you would have all read this incident about the Al-Qaeda trying to capture the Pakistan naval ship Zulfikar. And the aim was to capture the ship and then to use it against whatever the targets were. Now the Pakistanis actually have declared that they're going to place nuclear weapons on their naval platforms. Now imagine if Al-Qaeda is in future able to capture any of the Pakistan naval platforms hosting a nuclear weapon. So you have a situation of nuclear weapon falling in the hands of terrorists, and their nuclear weapons loose at sea. So the issue here comes really into this, that if you are starting to look at the issue in terms of balancing, ultimately the question really is that first issue is stability. If you are going to invest $64 billion in Pakistan, for example, and if Pakistan becomes unstable because of all kind of reasons, also because of the fact that they are not able to exorcise terrorism, which actually embedded in the structure, then, a country becoming unstable, a governance system becoming unstable, in whose interest would that actually be? Would it be in interest of China? Would it be in interest of India? Would it be in interest of any other country? Thank you.
Doctor, who would like to respond?
I will start from the last question. It seems to me that the China investment will lead to instability, or lead to the fragile situation in some of the countries. I think it's really a biased observation, maybe mainly influenced by Western media, who lack the resources to invest, or maybe because of their envy. What I want to say is that now, because those countries tried IMF way, WB way for so many years, but still left behind. still lack of development. Now China, okay, said that we have the China ways, the BRI ways. We can, the first capitals, we can help you to mobilize. Then you develop your solid infrastructures. Then you get development. We know that you lack the capitals, but we can help you because especially China want to that be connected with the surroundings, especially China using this money mainly in the surrounding regions, because China have the strong philosophy that development really needs to stability, lasting stability, and also building infrastructure constructions can really lead to laying down solid base for future lasting development. Our trip recently to Sri Lanka, to Bangladesh, they all say very highly about China's investment, China's assistance in laying down their future, the base for their future development. Otherwise, of course, take Hambantota port for example. Sri Lanka had asked India to help him to build the port, okay, to take full advantage of the geolocation that is 10 or 12 miles away to the main slopes of Indian Ocean, but no one responds. So now China said, okay. Now just the very example to support my idea that this will lead development is that recently one Indian company decided to invest $3.8 billion in refinery facilities just beside Hambantota port. There is another investment which around $12 billion, also in some place near the port. What I want to say that this kind of foundation, which was of course imposed by China, will finally lead a sustainable development for some of the countries who lack this kind of resources. We know that in the past so many years, the Western tried their ways, but I don't think someone get succeeded. We know the IMF way in helping Indonesia to fight against the financial crisis in 1997, but Indonesia is still fragile, struggling. So this is China's way. Of course, frankly speaking, this is the mega project which China never tried in the past. So be more patient and be more positive about it. Just as one of my friends, the Constantino mentioned that now when China and Nepal talking about cooperation, we now also focusing on sustainability. Of course, this is Chinese money, Chinese investment. Of course, we do not want to this kind of investment to go in vain. So we're not changing the behavior. Want to listen or to match each other's development plan in a more economic way. This is what I want to respond to you. Just now, you also mentioned about strategic unbalancing. Whether the bad guys will get access to the submarine, to the nuclear bombs. Of course, if you have something, of course, this kind of possibility cannot be totally excluded. But Pakistan, anyway, is still a country which, how can I say, we can develop cooperation, and we have very rigid supervision mechanism, especially related to the nuclear bombs. Even the U.S. also. Also have some concern, but still have the normal military relations with Pakistan. It doesn't mean if any country has a bad guy, you will not develop any relations to that country. That is not the way. As a matter of fact, China and Pakistan enjoy a very solid relations. Of course, we have that concern. That is one way China has carried forward CPEC. One of the major purposes of CPEC is that we want to transforming the Pakistan's economic structure to create more jobs for the youngsters, which the average age is 26 in the population, which is nearly 200 billion populations. That we want the Chinese way. We wanted becoming a successful story to help Pakistan to stand on its own feet more firmly. With it will be more easier to deal with Pakistan, which has strong self-confidence. When it is more easier to deal with Pakistan for focusing the strategy or mindset, especially on development. I think that is what China wants to manage to pushing forward that kind of development of Pakistan. I think that it will also serve the national interests of India if Pakistan focusing on development, even the generals focusing on development. That is also why the CPEC involves several projects which was contracted with the army company. As for what is the others? South China Sea, I would like ask my colleague, which it is there. They are at a better position than me to answer the questions. As to the rule-based world, I think that in this world there is no universal rules adapted towards everything. I think when we're talking about specific issues, they also have some specific rules. Take that arbitrary issue. China is also following the rules elaborated in the UNESCO. It is not against the rules. So when we're talking about rules, okay, China choose this part of the rules, while the Filipino choosing that part of the rules. So there is no common universal accepted rules. That is also why when U.S. said, okay, we'll follow the rule-based order, China feel very suspicious about it. Whose rules? Or who have the final sayings? Now China finally accepted. Okay. When you're talking about rule-based China, of course, rule-based. We have our interpretation. You have your interpretation. In order to reducing the suspicion or misunderstanding, we communicate with each other. We talk like this to talk with each other, to understanding what is the commonalities regarding to the rules. That is my general response to that. But of course, any order needs rules. Suppose in South China Sea, China don't practice in a parallel way. One is a bilateral. Bilateral means that to negotiate with those who are direct related to the disputes. Now, another way is that we go in an active way. We regard the centrality of the ASEAN in how to maintain the the South China Sea to be more peaceful and cooperative. I think that is question raised to us. I stop here.
I would like to follow Professor Hu to talk about the rule-based order and also the 9-line issues and the award in 2016. And actually, to my understanding, your question is one question. That is about how China to see the current international system, and this is the big question. And I would like to share my views with the following 3 points. And the first one is why China do not accept the award in 2016. It's not because China do not abide by the current international law, especially UNCLOS, just because of the case itself and especially the award itself. I would like to take 2 examples because the core the most important concern from Chinese side is that the award by the tribunal went too much beyond its authorization. 2 examples. First is the Philippines only requested the tribunal to judge several maritime features in the South China Sea, but the tribunal finally judged all features in the sea.
9-dash lines. Philippines also asked 9-dash lines.
I'll explain this later. So that's one. Could you imagine that we know the case between Bangladesh and India before the international court? Could you imagine that if the Bengali side requests only this part of issue, but the court finally judged all of the issues? could you imagine that the Indian government could accept the final judge? Went beyond its authorization too much from China's perspective. It's not illegal. And the second example is that the tribunal said in the final ruling that it doesn't judge the maritime delimitation between China and the Philippines. But whatever China's claims, take example, whatever China's sovereign claims over mischief reef is valid or not, China do claims its sovereignty over these features. But in the final ruling, the tribunal said the mischief reef is a part of the Philippines EEZ. So the tribunal's ruling directly from China's perspective directly referred to the maritime delimitation between China and the Philippines. Also went beyond its authorization too much. So there's two examples. The first question, and the second about the follow-ups by the United States in the South China Sea region. Actually, from my personal view, it's not about the military conflict or contradiction between China and the United States. It's about the different interpretation and application of the UNCLOS in the South China Sea. And this issue is not a new issue between China and the US. It's a long-term issue from 1958 when UN held the first conference on the law of the sea. From then, China and the US have different understanding about the international law of the sea. When China claims the 12 nautical miles of territorial sea, and also India, but the US claims the 3 miles. So it's from the 1958. It's a long-term question, not about military. Yes, it reflected by the military activity, but not a military issue. It's a legal issue. Sorry. The last point.
Mr. Chang, can you also comment on the militarization of the South China Sea?
Okay, later. The third point about the 9-dash line. I'm not sure if you read the statement by Chinese government in 2016 after the tribunal published its final ruling. China published issued a statement on its position on the South China Sea issues. And in this statement, for the first time, Chinese government do not introduce the item of 9-dash line. No. In the formal position of Chinese government, China only claims the historical rights in the South China Sea. No 9-dash line. So, from my personal view, it's a small but significant change.
Yeah, quick follow-up.
You can have
Follow-up.
offline discussions.
Point. Just one second.
Yeah, running out.
Okay, just quick point.
I think you'll be.
All right, okay, but I thought you should clarify.
Yeah.
Please go.
Okay. As a contracting party of the UNCLOS, China has the duty to abide by the current provisions. And I believe that from this small but significant change, China is doing its efforts to make it its claims in the South China Sea to be in accordance with the UNCLOS. But on the other hand, we have to know that in the preamble of UNCLOS, it stated that the issues not provided by UNCLOS should apply to the general international law. And from Chinese government, China's official position, the 9-dash line is something is a question not provided by the UNCLOS, so it applies to the general international law. That's China's position. So also, I don't say that on the other hand, And the above I said is China is doing its efforts to make it comply with the UNCLOS. So that's the 9-dash line. And about the militarization issues, China and the US have different understanding about militarization. From US side, any military deployment in the maritime fisheries in the South China Sea is militarization. But from China's perspective, especially for most of scholars in China, only the maritime fisheries constructed by Chinese government to an entire naval or air force base, it means militarization. But even according to the report published by the Defense Statement of the United States last year, it said that there is no naval and air force base in the separated islands. This comes from the U.S. Defense Department's report to the Congress.
We are running out of time, so I'll give one opportunity to Dr. Joshi in case he has any comments.
I just want to respond to Dr. Wo's point on the Quad Plus. I think it's very clear from the previous conversation, previous discussion as well, that there was a situation arising in the South China Sea which was generating a certain degree of tension. It was you call it militarization, phone-ops, etc. And there was a feeling among certain countries that Chinese assertion was going beyond the point. And I think the Quad is a response to that, but the Quad response is a very measured response. As I said, it is not a military alliance. It is basically, you can call it a proto-military alliance. In the sense, should China become more assertive? Should China become a bigger problem for the countries? Should China affect the navigation, which it does not right now? But in future, if there is a situation where China is creating problems on navigation, air navigation, sea navigation, then maybe the Quad can assume a different shape. But as of now, it remains a diplomatic grouping. And what it is involved in is diplomatic coordination. With the basic idea, as I said, was that we are trying to persuade the countries, the 4 countries of the Quad are trying to persuade China that military assertion is not the way out, that these issues can be resolved through non-military means.
Well, we had some very good discussions